Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Just give everybody about another minute to hop on. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, happy Wednesday. Welcome to our professional development series for grades 3 through 12, content literacy in action. Let me just make sure I'm recording. Okay. Content literacy in action, supporting literacy in all content areas. And I'm super excited to kick off the second half of our double feature. We had been talking about the lift kit. So today we're kind of diving into content literacy and these content literacy texts. So really excited about that. So today we're focusing on annotating text. Okay, so we have two objectives today. Participants will be able to explain the purpose of the content literacy supports, and you're going to be able to implement the annotating text support with students while using your high quality instructional materials. Our agenda is going to do an overview of the content literacy series, the purpose of annotating text support, and then we're going to talk about how to use it. We're going to see it in action, some next steps, and a closure. Okay, so let's just talk very briefly about literacy in grades 3 through 12. So this is Scarbo's reading rope, and Scarbo is an expert in how we learn to read, how the brain reads, how we learn to read, becoming a skilled reader. So there's two components. The upper component is our language comprehension component. And all of these different things make up language comprehension. And then we have the bottom strand, which is word recognition. And word recognition focuses on phonological awareness, decoding, and adding words to our sight vocabulary. You're seeing them and decoding them enough that they become imprinted. Now, in grades, especially in grades 6 through 12, we are hoping, this is not always the case, but we're hoping that word recognition is developed when they come to us, that it's automatic enough that they can read. Okay, so it is really our focus in these upper elementary, middle, and high school grades to focus on language comprehension. Okay, so the first 4 sessions I did in this series and the first half of the double feature really focused on what to do if word recognition is not developed. The next few sessions, including today's, is really going to focus on that language comprehension piece and how we can develop it inside of our tier 1 instruction in a whole class environment. Okay, so background knowledge is something that as we become more proficient and we know more background knowledge, it helps us to comprehend what we're reading better. The same thing for vocabulary. The more breadth and depth we have in our vocabulary knowledge, the easier it is for us to comprehend what it is that we're reading. Language structures. Grammar has not been explicitly taught in a while. And so we're remedying this because we understand that sentences are thought bubbles and they're organized that way. Paragraphs are bigger thought bubbles. And so the more understanding students have around this, the more it improves their comprehension as well. And lastly, verbal reasoning. So their ability to read and truly understand and interpret the message, what they're reading, not just what's black and white on the page, inferences and metaphors. And then lastly, literacy knowledge, print concepts. Do they understand how to read a narrative differently than they understand how to read and extract information from an informational text? Okay, so as we become more strategic with that upper part of the rope, which is really the focus in upper elementary, middle, and high, as we become more strategic, this helps us to become a more skilled reader. And so we're going to talk more about that and see what that looks like. So content area literacy it's the skills that involve basic content comprehension and writing skills. These are the skills. Can a student come to our class? Can they read and write about and understand what it is, the topic, whatever the content area is? Until the fundamental content literacy skills are mastered, there's a need to build competency here before moving on. And we're going to talk about what they would move on to. Skills such as partner reading, analyzing rubrics, and annotating text are crucial to proficiency before moving on to more demanding literacy skills. And we can build proficiency within the upper strands of Scarbo's reading rope that we just looked at, while the lower strands are being developed using LIFT or any other program to build word recognition skills. The thing I want you to take away, the biggest takeaway from the content literacy series is, even if students are not proficient in reading independently, we are still able to develop that whole top strand of the rope. And when students are not on level, sometimes we have an inclination to give them material that we think is more on their level. And so we give them lower level stuff because we want to help them access that. But what we're doing, I'm going to go back a slide. What we're doing when we do that is we're limiting now what background knowledge they're exposed to. We're limiting the vocabulary that they're exposed to. We're limiting language structures and complex sentences. We're limiting all of these things. And these things can be built even through a read aloud or a partner read. They don't have to be independently read for us to develop these things. So that's why it's so important that we stick within our tier 1 high quality instructional materials, but it's also important that we have the supports we need to help our students access that. So that's really what the series is about. Okay, so I don't know if you've ever heard of disciplinary literacy, but this is a compare and contrast of content area literacy and disciplinary literacy. So I kind of told you that content literacy focuses on the basic content comprehension and writing. It's all those skills we just saw embedded in Scarbo's reading rope, and it's used across all of our subject areas. So content literacy is content literacy in math, in science, in social studies, in English, and language arts. Disciplinary literacy, on the other hand, is the knowledge and abilities used by those who create and communicate knowledge within the disciplines. Okay, this is when we hear things like reading like a historian and thinking like a scientist. These are upper level literacy skills. And you can work on both at the same time, but for students to independently engage in disciplinary literacy, they have to master content literacy skills first. Okay, both of them involve reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and both of them involve text. So what's the impact of content area literacy? Well, the most recent NAEP data that we have for Louisiana in 2019 says that 73% of our 8th grade students fall below the proficient level in their ability to read and comprehend the meaning of text. So we know, and I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, our students need help accessing the information. So this session is about how to help them access it. Students need to extract information and meaning from content area text. Reading ability is a key predictor of achievement in mathematics and science. Students need literacy support in accessing the information so that they can become more proficient within their disciplines. So if they're able to read and comprehend and interpret or listen and process information around those disciplines, it's a no-brainer. They're going to become more proficient within those disciplines. Okay, so we're going to dive into it. Here's the content literacy series. And so this builds proficiency within the 4 areas of literacy: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, using your high quality instructional materials in a whole class setting. That's what the content literacy series is about. So it's broken up into those 4 components of literacy: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So for reading, these are the supports that are currently available. I'm going to show you how to access them. So whole class read aloud, partner reading, independent reading, annotating text, which is what we'll dive into today together, direct and explicit vocabulary instruction, and reading and writing for a purpose. And each week, we're going to take a look at different ones. And I'm going to show you what they look like in action. I already have a partner reading, and on the next slide, you'll see writing. I already have a video up for those 2 from previous PDs, so I'll show you how to access that as well. But we're really going to dive into annotating text today. What I want to say about this before we keep going any further, though, is these are not things that are rocket science. These are not things that you probably aren't already doing or not in your curriculum. However, what I really want us to focus on in these sessions is when we think about the intentionality of these things and the purpose and the intent of them, and we leverage that as we're teaching, you're going to see literacy skills improve in your students when you really are intentional about the strategy or the support that you're focusing on, okay? So here are the writing ones: creating a claim, reading and writing for a purpose, summary writing to develop comprehension, using rubrics, using student exemplars, and writing frames. All of those that I've read so far are live on the website and they're ready for you to use. Coming soon is our speaking and listening component. So a discussion tracker, a Socratic seminar, and a fishbowl discussion, how to do those things. So I'm going to hop out of the presentation real quick, and I want you just to see where these are housed. So I'm going to put the link in the chat, but, oh, and Lisa already did. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so when you're coming over to our literacy library and you click on instruction, intervention, and extension, this is what you see. And the second big thing is our content literacy support resources. This is where I'm pulling this information from today. Okay, so there's a slide deck for the initial PD I did on this is here. And then all of the ones I just read to you, all those different supports are here. We're going to dive into one today. And the video is already there for building content area literacy in the secondary classroom. Is already here. And this one really goes into partner reading and using student exemplars as part of the writing process. So those are ready for you to use, to dig into, but let's dive back into our presentation. Okay. So specifically annotating. So what is the purpose of annotating text? Annotating text is something I've seen, teachers across the state do. It looks very different in different classrooms and different content areas. Sometimes science and social studies, you may or may not be doing this already, but the overall purpose of annotating text is to assist students in comprehending the text and the big ideas of the text, okay? And we model this so that they can independently start doing that on their own. Annotating text is a complex skill where students process what is being read and make connections to their content and the world around them. And so I'd like to tell, my trainees or my students that even me, a professional, a teacher, a master's degree, when I'm reading a very complex text and I'm not annotating it, I'm missing things. I don't even fully absorb the information I need to absorb. So it's a really important skill to have. When done correctly, annotations are thoughts and ideas that occur when reading a text. Annotations can tell the teacher what parts of the text the student understood and what they did not understand. It can also help identify if students struggle within a certain concept repeatedly and help them identify patterns. So if you have students annotate a text, and let's say it's a social studies text, and something that's very common in social studies is like a cause and effect, maybe. And you're asking them to annotate for that. And every now and then you're passing, you're walking through, every now and then you're checking the students' papers to see what the annotations look like. You're going to start to notice who really understands that text and what they're reading and who doesn't. Okay. And you're going to be able to help leverage some different things in your instruction as a result of that. Okay. So annotating text in action, let's jump in together. Okay, so if this was a live session, I would say, good afternoon, class, and you would say, good afternoon, Ms. Cleaver. Class, today we're going to annotate a text called The Tough Issues, determine what some major challenges were during the Constitutional Convention. Remember, we annotate text so that you can become more proficient with reading and understanding text. This will make it easier for you to find the key details and evidence to support those details in the future when you are doing this independently. So I'm going to model the first paragraph for you. I want you to pay attention to the symbols I use and how I explain my thinking so that you can do this on your own in a minute, okay? And then we're going to refer them back to the symbols that we're using, okay? So this next slide are some symbols. For the purposes of this exercise, we would definitely assume that I have already explicitly taught how to use symbols in my class before I dive into this. And these are just examples of some symbols. You are free to use whatever symbols you want to use. I will tell you the most important thing in annotation is not the symbols. It is really the thinking that you see on the side, the words that you see on the side, and what students are taking out of the reading is the most important thing, okay? This is just a place to help you or them start with how do you even know what to extract from the information, okay? So here are some annotation symbols. Circling words they don't know is very common in annotating. A question mark if they read something they don't understand. Underlining text that they know is really important. And when you're rolling out, if you have not used annotation symbols before in your classroom, I highly recommend that you pick 2 or 3 to start with. And then as they become more proficient, start layering and adding different symbols on. Don't just throw them the whole chart at one time and say, go annotate. Model how to use each one first and start with those top 3 or 4 are definitely the most important ones, okay? So this is really great too. Sometimes they'll read a whole passage they forgot where they found the answer. They forgot where the evidence was to support it. So using that E to support, showing the evidence that supports the main idea. If it's a text that is tied to a set of questions, numbering where number 1 or number 2 or number 3 can be found so they can very easily go back to that. That's a great strategy to use as well for the purposes of testing. You know, when they're taking their summative tests or even state testing, they can use little Post-it notes and putting number 2 next to that so they know to go back to that. A check mark when they read something that corroborates the sources or their own prior knowledge. So they're like, okay, that's what I was thinking. That's what I've learned before. Here's more clarification or further validation about that. It corroborates that. A smiley face if it reminds them of a personal connection. And then those 3 little lines, if it connects to an event or development in another time, place, or theme. So they can use those little lines to say, okay, this connects to something else that they were learning about. Okay, so let's jump into a source. And this one is really just from the social studies scope and sequence that's posted on the state's website. I wanted to use something with you that's something you're probably using every day. So for the purposes of this one, they're talking about the founding of the country. This is a 7th grade social studies lesson called The Tough Issues. And I'm telling the students, remember, you know, going back to this is why we annotate. This is what we're annotating for. We're focusing on challenges they had when forming the Constitutional Convention. And I model a paragraph for them. I model using the symbols. I model using my thinking out loud. I have this up on the Promethean board and they have it, their source in front of them as well, whether it's on the computer or a hard copy. And they're watching me at first. And then we do some guided practice and I start releasing them as we go. Okay. So I'm literally going to model for them. So tough issues. Remember, we're looking for challenges during the Constitutional Convention. So I'm going to start out. In spite of the common vision and status that linked most of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, no obvious route existed for how to revise the Articles of Confederation to build a stronger central government. And so I'm going to go ahead and circle delegates right now. I would circle this on the Promethean because that's not a word I'm super familiar with. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to keep reading though, because I haven't seen anything about the Constitutional Convention and what a challenge might have been yet. So let's keep reading. The meeting began by deciding several important procedural issues that were not controversial and that significantly shaped how the convention operated. First, George Washington was elected as the presiding officer, and we might circle presiding because we don't know what that means. They also decided to continue the voting precedent followed by the Congress where each state got 1 vote. I'm definitely going to circle precedent because that might not be familiar. And just me being a social studies teacher would say that's probably an important word. We're going to come across it again, and it really applies to our content. They also agreed to hold their meeting in secret. There would be no public access to the convention's discussions, and the delegates agreed not to discuss matters with the press. And again, press could be circled. For the purposes of time, I don't want to go all the way through this and annotate, but I'm happy if you want me to ever get back, I want to do a one-on-one with you or teachers at your district. I'm happy to do this. But I also have in the presentation kind of like a completed one that you can see. But I'm going to model for the students what I'm thinking as I'm reading. So in that first paragraph, Washington's role in the revolution and Shays' rebellion, that was something we had just talked about. And so I want to reiterate that to kind of bring them back to where this is happening now. My thoughts on the side is really what the students need to hear and see during annotation so they can see why I circled that, why I underlined that, really what's going on. That's the most important takeaway from annotating text. Let's jump back into our presentation. Okay. So it is essential to read the text ahead of time as the teacher and annotate your copy so that you have thoughts down that you can transfer and call on as needed. We don't want it to be a blind read, and we're kind of trying to think and process as we go. Walk students through them by modeling as many paragraphs as necessary. Be sure to use gradual release as students need as needed by the students. So let's say that I modeled 1 paragraph and I saw nothing about the Constitutional Convention. I might keep reading until I do, because there's more than one challenge in there, okay? Or whatever it is that you're teaching about. Also, let's say that I did my model of my paragraph and now I'm going to do a we do. We're going to do it guided practice together as a class. And as I'm calling on students to, what are their thoughts about the paragraph? What does this make them think? What does this corroborate? What is a main idea? If they can't answer in a guided practice, I might pull them back and model another paragraph before I release them. And just using them as a guide to determine how much modeling they need within that annotation before you release them. Of course, if you're doing an honors class, you might need to model this once or twice and they're totally proficient and good. You might need to just work with, some one-on-one students on the side. If this is an inclusion class, you might have to model it several times before they feel confident in doing this. Allow time for independent practice with annotating with feedback to improve students' proficiency with this skill. And that can look a couple of different ways. You can, after you've done this and model this as a teacher, you might want to release them to work as partners and have partners give feedback on annotations. Or you might be circulating and decide that you need to give feedback, especially focusing on those students who might struggle with this. Model as many times as necessary until you notice students are successful on their own. Okay, because that's the goal. And we want to tell them that. Sometimes they don't know what the purpose of this is. They don't know what they're supposed to be, what it's supposed to do for them. And they really need to understand that before they're going to take this on as a strategy of their own. But we want them to know why they need to do it, and we want them to know that the intent is for them to become independent with this so they don't need us anymore, and for them to understand how much this is going to help them answer questions on their own later. Okay. The purpose of annotating is not only to help student extract essential information, it is also to improve their proficiency with this skill so they can do it independently, kind of what I was just talking about. And I have that sample annotated version. When I post the slide deck for this, you'll see the slide deck and you'll see the recording of this too. Okay, so some next steps. You're going to introduce students to a routine for text symbols if they don't already have one. You can start there. Go through an upcoming text that you have coming up and annotate it for the purpose of that lesson. And I was in a training yesterday, actually, and it's something that sometimes I take for granted. Struggling students don't set a purpose or a goal for reading. And it was something I did with my students all the time. I helped them set a purpose and I eventually showed them how to set their own purpose. But helping them set that purpose is something that a non-struggling reader or proficient reader already does on their own. It's going to help them to monitor their reading, monitor their comprehension. And I have a strategy for that. It's called Reading and Writing for a Purpose. It's in the Content Literacy series too. Teach the lesson showing students how to annotate, do that modeling that we talked about. Use the students as a guide to determine how much modeling and how much guided practice they need before they become proficient with annotating, and watch students become more proficient with reading and extracting essential information on their own. That's the most exciting part about annotating, is watching them become more proficient with it. Okay. So before I get to the closure though, I just wanted to show y'all really what the annotating text support looks like. And all of the supports look the exact same way. They're outlined the same way. They start with how they can be used within the different content areas. Then it goes into who could this support. They're definitely meant for a whole class. It's just a teacher move, for which you can do whole class, but you can definitely do it in a small group environment too. There always is the purpose for that support, and it always talks about communicating that purpose. Adolescent students, especially, if they don't know why they're doing something, they probably are not going to really wholeheartedly engage in it, and they're not going to retain it. So we really need to communicate the purpose of why we're doing that if we want them to hold on to that and kind of buy into that process. After that top information, there's always a very detailed process for what you can do or say as the teacher, the steps that you need to go through, step 1, 2, 3, 4. It also has a video of a teacher using the annotation symbols. There's the annotation symbols document there that I just showed you, and the completed annotated text sample that I showed you as well. All your steps. I know I'm successful when. So if you're doing the annotation strategy correctly, you should see these things happening with your students. And then always additional considerations. Additional considerations is going to speak to specifically any special populations you might serve, students with disabilities or English language learners, some different additional things that you can do. Annotating text is a fantastic support to use with students who need extra support, because you can put as many scaffolds in there as you need to. So if you're annotating and you're going to release them and they have no idea what to highlight or annotate, you can plan some questions, some scaffolded questions in there before you release them, so they know kind of as you're asking them those questions, they're going to start asking themselves those questions, and that helps them to identify essential and important information going forward. Okay, so back into our closure. So annotating text allows us to read and process the text to extract the most essential information. That's why we do it. Modeling how to read and annotate text within all of the content areas allows students to see how someone within that content reads and processes the information. And so the more they see that and hear that, the more proficient they're going to become with it too. The annotating text content literacy support allows us to provide as much differentiation as needed by the group of students engaged in the support. So extra questioning, extra modeling, targeted paragraphs only. So that's another thing I want to mention. If you have students who really struggle to get through that whole passage, and you know where the most essential information is, and it's really important to build this skill, you might want to focus on one paragraph with them and build their proficiency by chunking it and then moving towards longer and longer passages. They just need exposure to content area text and building their proficiency with these skills. Improving skills within content literacy will improve proficiency within everyday literacy skills so that students will become more proficient at reading and writing. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you at Louisiana Literacy at la.gov. And I am so excited about the rest of the upcoming content literacy series because they really make a huge difference. My work as an instructional coach, as a master teacher, really just saw such a difference in the students across the campus when all of the teachers were kind of using the same supports. So I really hope y'all enjoyed that. I'm going to stop recording.